January 26, 1942. Belfast, Northern Ireland. The first American soldiers to arrive in Europe step off their transport ships onto British soil, and the senior British officers watching them are writing things in their private diaries that no one in Washington will be allowed to read. The men disembarking at Belfast's docks are from the 34th Infantry Division, the first American combat formation to reach the European theatre since the armistice of 1918. They are tall, well-fed, impressively equipped, the material abundance of American military logistics visible in the quality of their uniforms and the newness of their weapons, in a way that every British soldier who sees them immediately notices and immediately contrasts against his own 2 years of wartime austerity. They are also, in the assessment of the British professional military establishment, whose private correspondence begins accumulating on this subject the day the ships dock, untested. Untested in a way that has a specific meaning for men who have been tested continuously for 2.5 years, who have fought in France and been evacuated from Dunkirk under fire, who have watched the British Expeditionary Force, the trained professional nucleus of the army they now command, reduced to its human elements, stripped of its equipment, who have fought in the Western Desert and been pushed back across Libya and then pushed back again, who have fought in Malaya and Singapore and lost both in defeats, that the professional military's own honest assessment attributes not simply to enemy superiority, but to failures of their own preparation and command, who have been doing the hardest kind of work, the work of learning what modern warfare against a first-class enemy actually requires, not in training exercises but in engagements where the students who learn slowly pay in lives, who have been fighting a war at the end of a supply line that was never adequate against enemies, who, in those first 2 years, had demonstrated a consistent ability to translate their advantages into victories that the British Army had been unable to prevent. The British professional military's attitude toward the arriving Americans is not condescension in the simple social sense that popular accounts of the Anglo-American wartime relationship sometimes describe. The class-inflected British disdain for colonial brashness, the caricature of the British officer looking down his nose at the loud, overpaid, oversexed, and overhear Americans. It is something more specific and more professionally grounded. The particular wariness of men who have been doing a hard job under difficult conditions toward men who have not yet done it, whose confidence in their own ability to do it has not been tested by the conditions that test it, and whose cheerful self-assurance is, to the British eye, the most convincing evidence available that they do not yet understand what they have volunteered for. British soldiers who have come back from France and the desert have specific knowledge of what it costs to discover that gap between assumed capability and actual requirement, while facing a German opponent who will exploit every manifestation of it. They are not wrong to note the gap in the arriving Americans. They are noting something real, documented in the private writings of the most analytically honest senior officers in the British Army, because what they are seeing is what they themselves looked like before their own defeats taught them what they did not know, and they know, in a way that only veterans of those defeats can know, how expensive that education is when the teacher is the Wehrmacht. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff and the most important British military officer of the war, begins noting his assessments of American military leadership in his private diary almost immediately after the Americans arrive, and continues noting them through 1942 with a frankness that his characteristic professional restraint makes all the more striking when the entries reach their most critical passages. What Brooke writes across hundreds of diary entries, what General Harold Alexander writes in his private correspondence to Brooke and other senior officers, what General Bernard Montgomery writes in his private letters to family and to trusted colleagues in 1942. These are documents that shaped the Allied command relationship for the remainder of the war, that were kept private during the conflict, and that historians and the men they concerned have been examining ever since. They are, taken together, one of the most important and most honest professional assessments that any senior Allied military officer produces of another ally's military capability in the entire conflict. The British professional military's skepticism about American military capability in 1942 does not come from nowhere, and it does not exist solely in the private writing of men who never intended it to be read as policy. It comes from a specific historical experience, and from specific observations of the American Army's institutional characteristics in the months following the United States' entry into the war. The experience is the experience of a professional army that has been fighting for 2.5 years against the German and Italian military establishments, that has been defeated repeatedly in those 2.5 years, and that has learned from those defeats the specific lessons about what modern warfare at the highest level requires in terms of training, doctrine, combined arms coordination, and the specific quality of staff work that translates operational intention into tactical execution. The British Army of 1942 is not the British Army that went to France in 1939. It has been remade by disaster and by the specific institutional learning that disaster produces in a military establishment that is both willing and compelled to learn from it. Because the alternative to learning from the defeats at Dunkirk and in the Western Desert and in Malaya is more defeats of the same kind, and the army cannot afford more defeats of the same kind. The men who have done the remaking, Brooke above all, but also a generation of corps and divisional commanders who have survived their own failures in France and the desert, and have drawn from them the lessons that their soldiers' survival requires. Commanders like Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg in the Western Desert and Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks in the training commands that are producing the British Army's 1943 formations have a precise understanding of what their current army can and cannot do, of the gap between its present capability and the German opponents, and of how much further they need to go before they can attack with confidence of winning against a first-class opponent in a prepared defensive position. The British officers who write privately about American soldiers in 1942 are writing from inside this institutional experience. They have the specific knowledge of what a poorly trained combined arms formation looks like when it encounters a well-trained German one, because they have seen it happen to their own formations, in their own command, and they recognize in the early American formations the specific indicators, the all-arms coordination problems, the staff work deficiencies, the command hesitation at the point of crisis, that their own defeats had displayed before their own institutional learning addressed them. Into this institutional reality arrived the Americans, confident, well-resourced, tactically untested, and led at the highest levels by men whose careers have been built in an army whose most recent major combat experience, the First World War, ended 24 years ago, and whose preparation for the current conflict has been compressed into 18 months of mobilization. At Brooke's diary entry for June 23, 1942, one of the most candid passages in the most candid private military diary of the war, describes a meeting with General George Marshall and his principal staff officers with a directness that his characteristic understatement makes more, rather than less, striking. He finds Marshall a pleasant and good-natured man who does not, in Brooke's judgment, have the strategic grasp that the position of American Army Chief of Staff requires, a judgment that Brooke records not with any visible satisfaction, but with the specific professional concern of a man who needs his counterpart to be more than he currently appears to be, and who has found the assessment forced on him by evidence he cannot honestly interpret differently. Brooke's specific concern about Marshall in June 1942 is strategic rather than operational. He finds the American Army Chief of Staff committed to the proposition that the shortest path to Germany is across the English Channel, a conviction that Brooke regards as demonstrating insufficient appreciation for the specific operational conditions, the inadequacy of available shipping for a cross-channel assault of the scale that would actually threaten the German position in France, the demonstrated unreadiness of American forces for the combined arms operations that the German coastal defenses would require, the strength of the Luftwaffe's position in northern France, and the specific lesson of the Dieppe raid in August 1942, where a Canadian-led assault on the French coast is destroyed in 9 hours, with 60% casualties, and provides the most direct available evidence of what the German coastal defense system can do to an amphibious assault that is not prepared to the level the defense demands, that make a 1942 cross-channel operation not merely ambitious, but suicidal. Brooke's diary entries through the summer of 1942, as the sledgehammer debate runs its course, document the full range of his frustration with what he perceives as an American strategic naivety, rooted in insufficient appreciation of the operational realities that British experience has made clear. He is not wrong about the operational realities. He may be somewhat wrong about the roots of the American position, which is as much a product of American strategic analysis, the specifically American calculation that the shortest path between 2 points is the one that goes in a straight line, applied to military strategy with the same pragmatic directness that the American military tradition brings to most problems, as of American inexperience. But the specific operational objections he advances against Sledgehammer are objections that the subsequent operational record of Normandy in June 1944 validates as entirely legitimate. Normandy succeeds because it is prepared with 2 years of additional shipping, 2 years of additional landing craft production, 2 years of amphibious training for the forces that execute it, and the specific hard-won operational knowledge of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy that gives the 1944 assault commanders a qualitative understanding of what the German coastal defense can do and what it requires to overcome it. None of that preparation exists in 1942. Brooke knows it does not exist. On this specific point, his diary entries are right. The Sledgehammer debate, which occupies the summer of 1942, and which ends with the British successfully arguing against the American position and substituting torch, is conducted publicly, with professional courtesy, and privately, with a candor in both Allies' communications that the professional stakes make understandable. The British are arguing against a plan whose failure would cost lives they cannot afford to lose, in a theatre they cannot afford to lose, and the Americans are arguing for a plan whose strategic logic they understand as the most direct application of their superior resources to the war's most important objective. This is a man who would prove, in the subsequent years of the war, to be one of the finest military administrators in modern history, and one of the most effective organizers of military power that any nation has produced. Brooke's 1942 judgment of him is wrong in the way that first impressions often are, and right in the specific professional sense that he means it. Marshall in 1942 is not yet the Marshall of 1944, and the American Army in 1942 is not yet the American Army of 1944, and the gap between what the Americans are in 1942 and what the war will require them to be is the specific subject of Brooke's private anxiety throughout the year. November 8, 1942. The coast of Northwest Africa. Operation Torch begins. The Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa that represents the first major combined military operation of the coalition and the first test of American ground forces against organized opposition in the European theater. The American landings at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers are opposed by Vichy French forces, not by the German army, and they succeed in their essential objective of establishing the coalition's presence in North Africa. But the manner of their success, the planning difficulties, the coordination problems, the specific command and control failures that occur in the Oran and Casablanca sectors, produces in the British observers a set of private assessments that are, across the board, more critical than the operation's ultimate success would seem to warrant. General Harold Alexander, one of the most experienced combat commanders in the British Army, after operations in Dunkirk, the Western Desert, and Burma, who will become Deputy Supreme Commander in the North African Theatre under Eisenhower in February 1943, writes to Alan Brooke in the days after Torch, with assessments of American unit performance that are specific in the way that only an experienced combat observer's assessments can be specific, identifying not general inadequacy, but particular deficiencies in particular contexts, the kind of analysis that requires both operational knowledge of what the situation demanded and professional knowledge of what trained units should have been able to provide. Brooke receives these assessments and records them in his own diary with a specific private satisfaction that he has the professional honesty to simultaneously acknowledge as professionally problematic, the satisfaction of a man who has predicted something and found his prediction confirmed, tempered by the knowledge that the things being confirmed are not things he actually wants to be right about, because they are things about an ally whose effectiveness he requires, and whose current inadequacy makes the war more dangerous and more costly than it should be. The specific failures that Alexander and Brooke's network of observers identify in the American performance at Torch are not failures of courage. The American soldiers who fight at Oran and Casablanca are not accused by any serious British observer of lacking personal bravery. They are failures of the specific institutional competences that 2 years of combat against the Germans have taught the British to regard as the primary determinants of success in the modern battle. The coordination of all-arms combat, the quality of artillery-infantry armor integration at the battalion and regimental level, the staff work that produces orders that reach their recipients on time and in a form that permits execution, and the specific individual judgment of company and battalion commanders, whose training and experience have not yet produced the specific quality that the British identify, in their private correspondence, as the ability to read the battle as it is, rather than as it was planned to be. The near failure that crystallizes British private assessments of the American Army in 1942 does not occur until February 1943, technically outside the year the title describes, but so directly continuous with the 1942 command relationships and private assessments that any honest account of the British general's private writings about the American soldier in 1942 must address it. The Battle of Kasserine Pass on February 14 to 25, 1943, is the moment when German forces under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, coordinating an attack through the Kasserine and Fayyid passes in the western dorsal mountains of Tunisia, drive through positions held by American Second Corps under Major General Lloyd Fredendall in a series of engagements that produces the largest American defeat in the European theater to that point, killing, wounding, or capturing approximately 6,500 American soldiers and destroying or capturing more than 300 vehicles, approximately 200 artillery pieces, and substantial quantities of supplies and ammunition in 4 days of fighting that validates, in the most painful operational terms available, exactly the specific institutional weaknesses that the British private assessments of 1942 had identified. Fredendall himself commands from a command post 40 miles behind the front, in a cave complex whose excavation has consumed more engineer resources than the defensive positions his forward units are occupying, a physical manifestation of a command posture that every experienced combat commander who becomes aware of it finds professionally inexplicable, because the command post of a corps commander in an active battle needs to be close enough to the front that the information reaching it is current, and the orders leaving it can affect events before those events have resolved themselves without him. The American defensive positions at Kasserine are not outfought in the sense that a better-equipped opponent outfights a lesser-equipped one through material superiority. The Germans at Kasserine are not materially superior to the Americans in any decisive way, and the American soldiers defending the pass are not lacking in physical courage or individual will to fight. They are outthought and outmaneuvered at the battalion and brigade level, in the specific and technically precise sense that German commanders at every level from company to corps are reading the battle as it develops and adjusting their actions to what they see in front of them, while the American commanders opposing them are in many cases executing the plan they were given before the battle began, without the specific readjustment to developing circumstances that the battle is producing every hour. The German attack opens on February 14th, with Kampfgruppe Ziegler, approximately 100 tanks and supporting infantry and artillery of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, striking through the Fayyid Pass and driving northwest against American positions at Sidi Bouzid. The American 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A, holding the Sidi Bouzid position with approximately 50 tanks and supporting infantry, is struck on its flanks simultaneously by 2 German columns whose approach routes the American defensive plan had not anticipated, and for whose appearance the unit commanders on the ground have not been given contingency instructions. The flanking attacks drive American infantry off the dominating ground around Sidi Bouzid before the American tank commanders can reorganize their defensive positions to account for the changed situation. By nightfall on February 14th, American Combat Command A has lost approximately 100 vehicles and suffered heavy casualties, and the defense of Sidi Bouzid has collapsed in a way that opens the route to Kasserine to the subsequent German attack. The specific adjustment, the rapid local decision, the commitment of reserve at the right moment, without waiting for orders from a higher headquarters that the communications situation has made temporarily unreachable, is not something that 1942 American training has reliably produced in the commanders who need to make it on February 14th. Alexander, assuming command of 18th Army Group on February 18th in the middle of the Kasserine crisis, sends Brooke a private assessment of the American Army's performance that becomes one of the most frequently quoted private military communications of the North African campaign. He describes the American formations as raw, in the specific technical sense that the word carries in professional military writing, not poorly brave, not lacking in will to fight, but insufficiently trained in the specific tactical and command competencies that modern warfare against a first-class opponent requires. The assessment is honest. It is also, in the specific way that honest assessments produced in the middle of a crisis tend to be, more critical of structural problems and less attentive to the specific circumstances, the quality of the German attack, the specific intelligence failures that left Toon Corps without adequate warning, the inadequacy of the defensive positions that had been selected before Alexander's arrival, that contributed to the defeat alongside the institutional weaknesses that the assessment correctly identifies. The American response to Kasserine, and to the pattern of British private criticism that the American command is increasingly aware of through early 1943, is the response of a military establishment that takes its failures seriously and that has the institutional capacity and the organizational authority to address them. General George Patton assumes command of Toon Corps on March 6, 1943, 11 days after Kasserine, and immediately imposes on the American forces in Tunisia a training and discipline regime that addresses, with a directness and energy that British observers find both impressive and characteristically American in its combination of bluntness and speed, exactly the institutional deficiencies that Alexander's private assessment had identified. Patton's methods are not subtle. He fines officers for not wearing proper uniform in the field. He requires tactical exercises and after-action reviews at a frequency and intensity that the operational situation barely accommodates. He fires officers who do not perform to the standard he demands, with a speed and a public directness that the American Army's personnel culture had not previously exhibited in this theater, and he does so in ways whose visibility in the officer corps of Toon Corps sends a message that no memorandum or training directive can send as efficiently. And he produces results that are visible to British observers in the 3rd Corps' performance at El Guettar on March 23, 1943, where elements of the American 1st Infantry Division and the 9th Infantry Division, supported by tank destroyers and artillery, defeat the 10th Panzer Division's attack with a fire discipline, a combined arms coordination, and a tactical responsiveness at the battalion and regimental level that represents a qualitative difference from what the Kasserine engagements had produced just 5 weeks earlier. The 1st Infantry Division's positions at El Guettar allow the German armor to close to effective anti-tank range before opening fire, a controlled discipline that requires both training and the specific nerve that training produces, because the instinct of men who are watching enemy tanks advance toward them is to fire before the targets reach their most destructive range, not to hold fire until the moment that maximizes the probability of a kill. The tanks that advance into El Guettar's defensive position find themselves in a fire from multiple directions, from weapons that have been positioned to cover each other's approach routes, a defensive scheme whose design and execution resembles the combined arms defense that British training doctrine prescribes, and that the British observers monitoring the engagement from their own positions to the north find, with the specific satisfaction of watching an ally doing something that previously they had not done well, genuinely impressive. By the end of the Tunisia campaign in May 1943, the American army that the British private assessments of 1942 had described as raw is performing at a level that those assessments had projected as achievable only much later, through the accumulation of combat experience that the assessments had assumed would take years rather than months. Alan Brooks' diary entries on the American Army through the spring and summer of 1943 track, with the same honesty that had characterized his critical assessments of 1942, the specific improvements he is observing, with a precision that reflects his own professional knowledge of what the improvements represent, the quality of American staff work improving in ways that Torch's difficulties had suggested would require substantially longer to develop, specifically in the ability of American corps and divisional staffs to produce orders that arrive in executable form at the receiving units within the timeframes that mobile operations require. The quality of American tactical command improving in ways that Kasserine had suggested were still years from realization, specifically in the ability of battalion and regimental commanders to read developing tactical situations and make the adjustments without upward referral that the pace of modern combat demands, and the specific and cumulative competence of an army that has been learning faster than even the most optimistic British projections had projected as achievable in the time and experience available. Brooks' diary entry for September 1943, written after the Allied invasion of Sicily, has demonstrated American divisional and corps performance of a quality that he had not expected this early in the coalition's combined operational experience, contains the specific professional honesty that makes his diaries so valuable as a historical record. He acknowledges that the American army has improved faster than he expected, at a level of self-awareness about the limits of his own earlier predictions that military professionals of his seniority rarely demonstrate in any format. The American army was better than he thought it was going to be, by this point in time. He writes it down. The legacy of what British generals wrote in private about the American soldier in 1942 is not primarily a historical curiosity about Allied tensions in a past war, though the tensions were real, and their documentation in the private papers of Brooke, Alexander, and Montgomery has been a source of historical debate about the Anglo-American relationship that continues in military history scholarship decades after the war ended. The most serious of those debates concerns the specific question of whether the British private assessments were accurate, whether the American army of 1942 was as unprepared as Brooke and Alexander and Montgomery described, or whether the British generals were applying a standard derived from their own hard-won experience in a way that failed to adequately account for the pace at which an army building itself from near zero could develop combat capability. The honest answer, consistent with the operational evidence, is that the British assessments were accurate in their identification of specific institutional weaknesses and wrong in their projection of how long those weaknesses would persist. The American Army of 1942 was as raw as the British described, and the American Army of 1943 had addressed those weaknesses at a pace that the British assessments had not projected as achievable. It is a precise record of an institutional truth about military organizations that combat capability is not a fixed quantity and is not a function of the courage or the physical quality of the individuals composing a force, but a product of training, doctrine, combined arms integration, and command development that requires time and investment and, most critically, experience to reach the level that a first-class opponent demands. The British generals who wrote critically about American soldiers in 1942 were right about what they observed. They were wrong, in most cases, about the rate at which what they observed would improve. The American Army of 1942 is not the American Army of 1943 or 1944, and the specific rate of improvement, the speed with which an American military establishment that had been built from near zero in 18 months absorbed the combat experience of Tunisia and produced the force that would fight in Sicily and Italy and Normandy, exceeded what British professional assessment had projected as achievable in the time available. This excess, the American military's ability to improve faster than professional observers expected, is itself a subject that British private correspondence of 1943 and 1944 addresses with the same honesty that had characterized the critical assessments of 1942. Brooke's diary entries of 1943 and 1944 are as frank about what the Americans are getting right as his 1942 entries had been frank about what they were getting wrong. Montgomery's private correspondence tracks the same arc, from the specific and pointed criticisms of 1942 through a grudging professional respect in 1943 that the specific circumstances of the British-American relationship did not allow him to express publicly, and that his private letters preserve, with the same bluntness that made those letters so revealing in the first place. Montgomery's criticisms of American forces in 1942 and early 1943 are more personal and more pointed than Brooke's or Alexander's. Reflecting both his own specific personality, he is the most direct and least diplomatic of the senior British commanders, a quality that serves him better in private letters than in Allied command meetings, and his specific operational experience with American forces in the Tunisia campaign, where his 8th Army is operating on the southern axis, while American II Corps holds the western front, and where the coordination difficulties between the two forces are, from Montgomery's perspective, primarily a product of American command inadequacy, rather than of the operational complexity that any objective assessment of the situation would identify as equally contributing. His private letters to Brooke and to his own staff through the spring of 1943 describe American commanders with a frankness that American officers who become aware of the letters through the specific channels that Allied command relationships create for the informal circulation of private opinions find deeply offensive, and that reflects, in its harshness, something that is simultaneously a professional assessment and a personal limitation. Montgomery is not a man who easily distinguishes between the institution he is assessing and the individuals who represent it, and his criticisms of American formations often carry the specific weight of personal rather than institutional judgment. What the British generals wrote in private about the American soldier in 1942 is the first chapter of a longer story about how an army that was not ready for the war it had been asked to fight became, through the specific and painful process of learning under combat conditions, the force that more than any other single factor determined the war's outcome. The men who write the most critical assessments in 1942 are writing about an army that is still in the process of becoming what the war requires. The men they are writing about are doing the becoming in real time, at real cost, against a real enemy whose professionalism and experience they are in the process of matching and then exceeding. Alan Brooks' diary, read from 1942 through 1945, is one of the finest records of that process available in any archive, not because it tracks the failure it describes in 1942, but because it tracks, with equal honesty, the transformation that follows it. Brooke begins the diary's American passages as a skeptic whose professional experience gives him legitimate grounds for skepticism, and he ends them as a man who has watched those grounds progressively removed by an army that has done what armies rarely do, improved, under the specific pressure of wartime combat, faster than even the best-informed professional observer had projected as achievable. The private writings of British generals about the American soldier in 1942 are not the whole truth about the American soldier in 1942. They are the beginning of a truth that the subsequent 3 years of the war complete, the truth about what an army becomes when the gap between what it is and what the war requires is closed by the specific and irreplaceable education of fighting the war itself. What Brooke and Alexander and Montgomery wrote in private about American soldiers in 1942 is a verdict on what those soldiers were. What those soldiers became between 1942 and 1945 is the best possible response to that verdict, not a refutation delivered in argument, but a correction delivered in action, on beaches and in hedgerows and across rivers and through cities, at a cost that no honest assessment of what they were in 1942 could have projected as possible, and that every honest assessment of what they became in 1945 must acknowledge as one of the most complete institutional transformations in the history of modern war.